to Straight Up Paleo, where we talk all things nutrition straight up. I'm one of your hosts, Christina Rice. I'm a holistic health coach and a nutritional therapy practitioner in training currently living in Los Angeles. I'm also the creator of the health and wellness blog addictedtolovely.com and the host of the Actually Adultish podcast.
And I'm your other host, Kara Halderman. I'm a nutritional therapy practitioner from Dallas, Texas, creator of careaboutit.com, and co-host of the Low Carb Conversations podcast. In this podcast, we will be discussing all things paleo, health, and nutrition, along with answering questions straight from you.
If you want to submit a question for us to answer on the podcast, head to straightuppaleo.com or email us at straightuppaleo@gmail.com.
Remember our disclaimer. The materials in this podcast are only to be used for advice and are not to be used in place of general medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
If you want to support the show, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a rating and a review on iTunes. Enjoy the show.
Hey, Christina, how's it going?
Hey, Kara. It's going well over here. How are you?
Oh, hanging out in my house per usual. Any cool things going on over in LA?
Still hot. I'm freaking out because I just realized I leave so soon to go home for break. And when this episode comes out, I will be, I talk like I'm still in college for break. No, when this comes out, I'll be back in the Bay Area. So it's crazy that December is flying by, but yeah, that's kind of it. What about you? Anything new in the past 24 hours?
In the past 24 hours, I have been Christmas shopping, and I made a lot of Christmas cookies recently. I made these gluten-free, these are paleo. The sugar cookies I made were paleo, and I made gluten-free gingerbread cookies, and that was a good time. I love making cookies.
Yes, I know. Making cookies is the most Christmassy thing ever. I made a gingerbread house with my friend last night, and we decorated. Trader Joe's has this little ugly Christmas sweater cookies set that we made, so that was fun, but not paleo.
I saw that. I was like, wait, she's not going to eat that?
No, we never eat it. I mean, even when this is my tradition that I've done with my friend since we were 12, and we, even back when I ate crap, we never ate it because they don't taste good. Gingerbread houses don't taste good.
They really don't. They're hard and gross.
Yeah. So, and I was honestly really bitter because we got the gingerbread house kit from Trader Joe's, which we've never gotten before, and to make the icing, it's all this work. I'm used to just pre-made icing, and you have to actually physically make the icing. So I was a little irritated about the extra work I had to put into that, but it's fine. So now I have a little house in here, but I'll probably throw it away soon.
We have this tradition. Okay, it's not a tradition. We did this one time, but a couple years ago for Christmas, we go out to my grandma's house, and she lives on this I don't know, in the middle of nowhere, on a ranch or something like that. Not really a ranch, but whatever. She lives in the middle of nowhere. And we all go out there, and this one year we made gingerbread houses, and then we literally threw them on the ground and smashed them and destroyed them for fun.
That
and
sounds really therapeutic.
It really was okay, are you familiar with I'm trying to remember the name. The song that's I threw it on the ground, and it was by Lonely Island or something like that from SNL. Oh my God, you're missing out. But basically we did, if anyone out there knows what I'm talking about, basically we did a parody of I Threw It on the Ground by Lonely Island with gingerbread houses. It was great. It.
What are you doing for Christmas this year?
Just going to all freaking 12 Christmases that I have to go to. Not really 12, but on Christmas Day, I open presents with my mom, and then we go over to my mom's side of the family's house, and then I'll probably go to my boyfriend's side of the family's house. He has two sides. He has two sides to his family as well. So I'll probably go to both of those. And that's all in one day. It's like, I don't know, 4 or 5 different Christmases. And then the next day I go out to my grandma's house to see my dad's side of the family. So Christmas is always super eventful.
Yeah, that's busy.
Yeah. What about you? Are you just going to the Bay Area and you have like one big thing, or?
Yeah, we just do one big thing. My dad's side of the family is super spread out all over the United States. My mom's side, we're all in the same area, so that's the family like we always do holidays with. And my aunt and my mom usually switch off every year who's hosting. So this year my mom's hosting Christmas, so our whole extended family will come over, and we always do Christmas Eve with my childhood best friend, the one who like I made the gingerbread house with. Her and her family will come over for Christmas Eve, and we hang out with them that night. So it's a lot of fun.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Love it. Christmas is a good time.
It's my favorite time. I'm so freaking obsessed with it. And I'm so excited
right?
because of all the recipes. And by this time, I'm sure I will have a bunch more recipes. I have 4 that I'm putting up in the next week.
Oh my God.
That's going to be fun. So
that's awesome.
Yeah. I cannot wait.
Me either.
Other updates with you?
No, just really one thing that I cannot wait for is for people to hear this episode.
I know. I cannot wait. It's definitely a fabulous episode. I do, before we explain, I want to remind people though to sign up for my Paleo Women program, because signups are going to be open, and I'm going to increase the price in about a week. So if you want to get the lower price right now, head to my website and the links will be in the show notes. But it's amazing if you want to learn everything there is to know about not just eating paleo, but really just like the whole lifestyle. And it's kind of just a program of all the health information I know in my head over 5 weeks. So we cover cooking and eating and macronutrients, and also lifestyle stuff, exercise and sleep, and walking, movement. We cover balancing hormones, all the mistakes people make when they transition to a whole foods diet, all of that. So it'll be a lot of fun, and you get to be in the most amazing community. Actually, I'm super excited because the day this comes out, when I go back to the Bay Area, some of the girls who are in the last round of my program, they live in the East Bay. So I'm meeting up with them, and we're all having dinner together. There's like 4 of us.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So
that's so cool.
Yeah, we've it's really awesome because, it's a really great opportunity to meet people, like-minded people, and real friends. So, I feel really lucky. I've connected with all these women in the program, and like a lot of them have become my friends too. So it's really fun. I feel really blessed. So.
Oh, that's great. So everyone that's interested, now's your time to sign up for her program.
Yes.
Go do it.
It's the bomb. But yeah, so today's episode is amazing. You guys are gonna be mind blown yet again.
More protein talk today, you guys.
Yes. So we have Dr. Gabrielle Lyon on the podcast today. And she is a fellowship-trained nutrition and cognition physician who specializes in muscle-centric medicine. And she talks more about what that means on the podcast. And she leads the Ash Center for Comprehensive Medicine in Manhattan, and has a really incredible background, and is one of the few female physicians who's in, functional medicine. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and she has a really interesting stance as well on her practice. Like we said, she calls it muscle-centric medicine, and her whole philosophy is kind of revolved around protein, and that women, and really actually anyone in general, they're just not getting enough protein, and that what people consider high protein really should be normal protein amounts. So she really goes into depth explaining like why we need more protein than we think that we do, and what it does for our body. And we even talk about exercise and a whole bunch of other topics. But just another resource for you guys to kind of try out and see if it relates to you, because I know it's really interesting to me and Christina for sure about this whole protein thing, because as you guys know, we've talked about it before, protein seems to be a really demonized macronutrient, and a lot of people think that protein causes all sorts of diseases or, whatnot, and that you can have, when eating like really high protein, you can have a lot of issues. And so she kind of gives you the other side to that and shows you why we need a little bit more protein. But like always, bioindividuality is a thing. So take everything with a grain of salt, of course, but it's a really great perspective.
Yeah, and like we talked about last week, we really just want to show you guys all of these different perspectives. Like there are so many incredibly intelligent people, and we want to show you all the different sides of the story, because we know it can be really confusing when you're getting all this information. And I think just the point is, don't take any single thing you hear as the right answer. Like get every different perspective on the topic. And yeah, I think that Dr. Lyon is just such an incredible resource, and she really knows what she's talking about. She studied this for a long time. There's not that many people who are focusing on protein, so it's cool to get her perspective, and she's just an awesome human. She's really relatable and cool, and yeah, we love her. So I think you guys are going to love this one.
But before we dive in to this episode, just a quick reminder, do join our Facebook group, Straight Up Paleo Pals. It's a really cool community of women and a couple males that are chatting about all things health, and we talk about the episodes, and it's a really fun place. So go to Straight Up Paleo Pals, our Facebook page, and also send us in your questions for when we want to do a Q&A episode. So you can send that into straightuppaleo@gmail.com. Literally any question you have about health, we want to answer them. You can also do that on our website. You can go through a contact form or just through our email.
Yes, please send in those questions, because we love answering them. And it can be really anything related to health. Emotional health too. We like that.
Yes. Yes, we do.
Awesome. Let's just go ahead and hop into the interview. Hello, Dr. Lyon.
Hi.
How are you?
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. Kara and I are so excited to talk to you about all things protein, because we know that is your jam. So for people who aren't familiar with you, can you give a brief introduction for yourself?
Absolutely. So my name is Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and I have a functional medicine practice on 61st and 5th Avenue in New York City called the ASH Center. My primary focus is muscle-centric medicine. What that means is muscle is actually the organ of longevity. My practice is very heavily skewed towards nutrition. I did a fellowship at WashU in nutritional sciences and obesity medicine. So really all of my treatment modalities are geared towards nutritional interventions to augmenting muscle tissue, because muscle is actually the largest organ in the body, not the skin. Muscle is an endocrine organ. To keep the health of that organ together is the key to everything.
That's fascinating. So how does that, like having a lot of muscle, how does that affect the rest of your health? Like not just physically, the way that you look and having a lot of muscle mass, but you're saying that muscle is like an endocrine organ. So how does that impact the rest of your body?
Muscle is amazing. So muscle impacts the rest of your body because it provides not just the locomotion, which is what we think of when we move. That's the kind of architecture of the body, but it's also the infrastructure. Like I said before, the largest organ in the body. Everybody thinks about skin, but actually muscle is an organ. And it's your metabolic engine. It's your driver. It's responsible for carbohydrate metabolism. That means it's responsible for the amount of carbohydrates that you can consume in a day. It's responsible for fat oxidation. For example, people with elevated levels of cholesterol, the more muscle you have, the more your body will burn it because it's utilized by the muscle. It is responsible for your resting, the majority of your resting energy expenditure, which is what your body burns and utilizes at rest. And it is responsible for having all these beautiful anti-inflammatory effects. It releases myokines and things of that nature.
So we weren't going to get into this until later, but I just
we don't have to get into it. You guys can kind of flow how you want.
No, I want to ask right now. I want to start off because I want to get my answers question. So I feel like recently protein, and we've talked about this on other podcasts before, but I feel like recently protein has become sort of demonized in a lot of the health community, especially as keto's become this hot topic. I'm sure you know about that. What are your feelings toward that? Why do you think people are becoming afraid of it?
Well, I think that is a fantastic observation and question and statement. Protein is the black sheep of the macronutrient family. Mm-hmm. Everybody demonizes protein. And really, one of the things about it is protein, when it comes from an animal source, it becomes a very emotional decision to eat it. And when that happens, people just have all kinds of stories and lose track of really some of the important aspects of protein in terms of how it relates to health and amino acid metabolism. Protein is the only nutrient source with a face. And because of that, people really are skewed in terms of their perception. And when you think about the food guide pyramid, actually what people don't really understand is that it was really propaganda driven, and it was created by people with a more vegan, vegetarian perspective. Doesn't mean that that's bad, but what it did is it really demonized protein because of that. And that's really what when we think of the history of protein and then we think of the history of the food guide pyramid, it really came from people that were much more vegetarian, vegan based. And as a result, protein became very demonized. And there was all kinds of myths surrounding it. For example, my favorite is that protein is bad for your bone. Having done my fellowship at WashU in St. Louis, I did obesity medicine, and I also did a comprehensive geriatric clinic. And what we found was those that ate the highest amount of protein had the best bone density because, as you can imagine, bone is made from protein. I mean, there are just so many myths surrounding it, and I think people just have a very emotional decision, emotional thoughts.
Well, the one thing I'm wondering, what about, some people argue that high protein has negative effects on longevity because it stimulates mTOR, like people like Ron Rosedale and Dr. Mercola. They say it stimulates cancer growth. How do you feel about that? What about the mTOR situation?
The mTOR situation, that's a good one. The largest driver of mTOR is actually insulin and carbohydrates and multiple feedings throughout the day. mTOR is not a negative thing. It is very necessary for many things, including which is muscle protein synthesis, which we know is really key, especially when you think of muscle being the organ of longevity. mTOR has just multiple ways that it is stimulated. You can think of it as stimulated, stress can stimulate it. Excess energy, really, that's a much larger driver, is the excess caloric intake. Yes, does protein stimulate mTOR? Absolutely. And it stimulates it through the mechanism of leucine. The amazing part about that is it's not a negative thing. It's absolutely necessary to stimulate your muscle. And without it, you don't actually get muscle turnover.
Okay. So where do you think we got this idea then that mTOR is like a bad thing and that protein causes cancer? Like, where did all this come from?
I think that if you really look back at the data and you really think about where the information comes from, people associated elevated levels of mTOR and high protein diets with cancer, not because of the high protein diet per se, but possibly because of the confounding variables. For example, if the people in the study didn't have a very healthy lifestyle. And I think that ended up really confusing the data. mTOR signaling in terms of protein has never been shown to cause cancer. Chronic mTOR signaling, chronic overfeeding, excess calories, excess level of insulin. That's what is really driving cancer. Cancer is not a protein disease. That's the most ridiculous thing. I was talking to a friend of mine, and one of the things that we were talking about is how to teach people how to think rather than tell them what to think. So hopefully throughout this podcast, we can really talk about ways in which to interpret the information out there so that you can make a good decision for yourself. So when you think of mTOR signaling, because everyone is saying that it causes cancer, really it's not about the protein.
I'm glad you cleared that up. So how much protein should people be eating?
This is a very interesting thing. When you're younger, you need less protein because your body is driven by hormones. When you become older, your body needs way more protein. So when you're in your 20s, you can get away with a lot of physical activity and very little protein. You could have 75 grams of protein a day or less and be fine. However, if you continue that on throughout your 20s and into your 30s, you really run into a problem. My basic recommendation is 90 grams for everybody when you really think about it. And I like to see people have 30 grams 3 times a day. And what that does is it allows for an elevated level of leucine. Leucine is an essential amino acid. And the key with leucine is it does trigger mTOR in 2.5 grams. So you need 2.5 grams of leucine to stimulate mTOR synthesis and mTOR signaling to the muscle for muscle protein synthesis. Anything below that level just counts as calories. So what ends up happening is you become over fat and under muscled.
That's so interesting.
So what happened? You mentioned that you can get away with not eating as much protein when you're younger because your body is driven by hormones. You said, but as you get older, you need more protein. So what's going on in our bodies? What is that shift where we need to increase our protein as we get older?
There's something that happens called anabolic resistance to the muscle, which means that the amino acids that you take in the form of protein actually don't trigger the synthesis of the protein as much as it did when you were younger. How that translates to practical application is as you age, you have to get a very specific amount of protein every time you eat to reach an amino acid level in the bloodstream to trigger that process. So you can do it a couple ways. 30 grams 3 times a day is super easy, or you can have 2 meals that say have 50 grams. And you max out the system of protein turnover, of muscle protein synthesis. And we know that muscle is so important because it is the organ of longevity.
Could you maybe give an example of what that would look like on a plate for maybe people who are, I know there are some people who aren't familiar with what is 30 grams of protein at a meal? What does that look like?
I'm so glad that you asked that question. Let's define the difference between quality protein and non-quality protein. When I say high quality protein, I mean anything that runs. That to me is high quality protein. Eggs are also high quality protein, but you need more of them to really reach that bolus, and fish is a little lower in protein. For example, you need 30 grams of protein. For every 1 gram of protein, for every 1 ounce of protein, there's 7 grams of protein. Does that make sense? So if you've got 4 ounces, 4 times 7 is 28. What you really need is around 5 ounces. You want to hit 35 grams of protein. If you're eating fish has 5 grams of protein per 1 ounce. In fact, if you wanted to trigger the stimulation of muscle protein synthesis, you would need 6 ounces or more of fish on your plate at one time.
Wow.
Okay.
So I don't know who's eating that. That's a lot.
That's like your whole hand, basically. Or is that less than your hand? That's about your whole hand.
Whole hand. And it's really interesting. You ladies are young. You don't need to eat that much right now. But if you are not aware of the transition that happens with your hormones and your activity level, then as you kind of progress out of your 20s, it really becomes a challenge, and you can catch it early if you are very aware and protein focused. I like to say that people should be protein centric. You can really change the trajectory of your life.
What about women?
With your hormone status.
Yeah.
What about women that are our age? Because we see a lot of women that are in their 30s or even 20s that have extremely low hormones already, like really low sex hormones. What would you do in that case? Do I still need like less protein if that were me?
I would definitely increase your protein. I would definitely increase your protein intake. Definitely resistance training. I believe very much so in heavyweight training. I think that is absolutely key to stimulating the muscle. There's only two ways as you age to stimulate muscle turnover and muscle growth and muscle protein synthesis. Number one is diet and number two is exercise. And if you are heavy plant-based and you are eating lower quality proteins, you need about 20% more. And that's a really high caloric load. For example, you would need easily a cup and a half of beans to equal one small chicken breast, and maybe more. You end up really bumping up your carbohydrate intake, and we know that carbohydrates stimulate insulin and cause dysregulation and fat storage and has negative effects on your hormonal balance.
Okay, so I have a question. How is it that some people who are vegan and vegetarian do get really muscular?
I believe that if you have a very specific phenotype in your genetic makeup, you have a very specific genetic makeup, maybe 2% of the population, you have what it takes to be exceptional being vegan and vegetarian. There is that biodiversity and individuality that happens. Mm-hmm. I don't see it often. I find that they can be very muscular when they are younger and maybe their training load is really high. And again, when you're younger, your muscle tissue is less dependent on your protein intake and more driven by the hormonal surges that you're having. What I have found is that as women and men age, if they remain largely vegetarian or vegan, then they end up putting on more body fat unless they are absolutely keeping up with a high intensity of training, because as we spoke about earlier, that is the second way to stimulate tissue.
So in terms of training, what do you usually recommend for people?
Depends on where they are in terms of their training age and their training status. Certainly having good compound movements, bench, deadlift, squats are all essential. What I found is the secret sauce is intensity and really working hard enough. Mm-hmm. That is key. When you go and you lift light weights and you do accessory work, whether it's biceps or triceps, and you're doing 10 to 15 reps or 20 reps, I find from a clinical perspective that the body doesn't change nearly as much. Another thing that's really important to point out is that after resistance training, your muscle is primed to utilize the protein that you eat after. So the faster that you have protein after you train, you actually can eat less protein after you train and have a bigger impact because that muscle is primed.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you about, because I've heard it both ways. Some people say, if you're lifting heavy, you need more protein, and then others, no, if you're more active, you actually need less protein.
You need less protein. If you are lifting heavy, you actually do need less protein because you're from a standpoint of stimulating your tissue. However, if you're going for recovery, I typically recommend a gram of protein per pound of body weight. For example, if I have a 200-pound man and he is doing heavy lifting, I typically recommend somewhere between 180 to 200 grams of protein for recovery.
Wow.
And where in terms of recovery, so if you're lifting really heavy and you lower your protein, would you recommend upping your carbohydrate intake, or what would you eat more of in a recovery standpoint?
The most important thing for the recovery of tissue is branched chain amino acids. That is the fuel for the muscle. When you want to replenish muscle glycogen, if you've done a really hard training session, that's absolutely important. But you could get away with 30 to 50 grams max.
Okay. And can you go into this myth? I've heard you talk about this before, but we've heard in the health space, people say you can't digest more than 25, 30 grams of protein at a time.
So ridiculous.
It's just so prevalent everywhere.
You could digest 100 grams of protein. Of course, where else is it going to go? Now you max out the lock and key system. I mean, you max out your mTOR signaling. You probably max it out at 50, but you digest all of it.
Oh, yeah. You digest all of it. So
of course
I don't know
do.
what they're trying to say. They're trying to say you can't utilize more than 25 or 30 grams?
Use all of it. You may not utilize the rest. So once the mTOR signaling for muscle protein synthesis does have a capacity, a saturation capacity. When that happens, that's probably around 50 grams of protein, but the other 50 grams of protein are still utilized in the body. There's tons of other roles of the amino acids in the body. So it is all utilized.
What are some of those other roles?
Yeah.
Neurotransmitters, immune function, hormones, all of it. Anything that you can imagine likely involves protein.
Is it
glutamine? Everyone talks about glutamine for their gut.
Yeah.
Right.
Glutamine, alanine cycle happens in the muscle.
Is it possible to get too much protein? Like, is there an upper limit?
We've never found one. The research has never found one. They've gone up to 300 plus grams a day, and they've never found it.
Wow.
They've never found it to be detrimental. When you really look into the science, the randomized controlled trials at these excellent universities, they've never found it. But you know what they have found to be detrimental? I bet you both guess.
High carbs.
Excess carbohydrates and excess fat. Protein has the highest thermoeffective feeding, which means when you eat it, it actually requires the most to burn.
So can we talk a bit more about how it fits in with the other macronutrients? Like, do you advocate, I know, like, a lower carbohydrate diet. What is your opinion on, like, the high fat trend? Like, do you promote a high fat, high protein diet, a moderate fat? Like, what are your opinions on how it fits in with the other macros?
It all depends on the person. Mm-hmm. I will say that men tend to do much better on a high fat diet. They seem to do well in ketosis. The women that try to go into ketosis tend to do well. They have a honeymoon phase for about 3 weeks, and then I've seen them all get fat. They've all gained weight.
Yeah.
In terms of carbohydrates, the key when I think about carbohydrates is really everyone can get away with around 90 grams of carbohydrates. The rest you have to earn. What I mean by that is if you are doing a lot of activity, then you can incrementally increase your carbohydrates. Another really important point that your listeners should understand is that you don't want to have more than 30 grams of carbohydrates per meal, and always a 1-to-1 balance of protein to carbohydrates.
That's so interesting. That's actually really useful. I've never heard anybody say that.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Once you go over 30 grams of carbohydrates, you then mount an insulin response. And we know that, of course, we talked about insulin as the driver for fat deposition and all kinds of inflammatory effects in the body. Well, so when you, go ahead.
Well, speaking of that, so what about, what people in the keto space say that, too much protein is going to stimulate gluconeogenesis and spike your blood sugar?
Does that make any sense to you?
I mean,
right? Like, no, it doesn't. No. It causes, let's talk about this. It causes a phase 1 insulin release. It is a very slight, so protein causes a very slight insulin release. Mm-hmm. It's a phase 1 insulin release only, which is a very small amount, and it is necessary for mTOR signaling, which is why it really happens, and muscle protein synthesis. If you eat protein, it does get converted to glucose, and there is a gluconeogenesis process. It is a very challenging process for your body, and is extremely energy expensive. And again, I think it's all about demonizing protein because they're coming from the perspective of high fat. Of course, high fat is not bad. The problem becomes when we become so focused that the blinders are on to the rest of the science that's out there. I think that some people do on high fat. I think some people do really, really well vegetarian, and some people do fantastic vegan. It is really about finding out what works for you, number one. And number two, really identifying what the good science has shown. There are tons of randomized controlled trials that show that higher protein diets, especially with calorie restriction, help maintain lean tissue, help increase lean muscle mass, and decrease body fat. Who doesn't want that to happen? Lower inflammatory markers.
But this is in the presence of calorie restriction, you're saying, right?
Yes. Calories always matter. Calories matter, and balancing each meal matters. Every meal should have 30 grams of protein. It could be 30 to 50, depending on how you split it. And the carbohydrates should not be over 30 grams per meal. And typically, we never recommend people have carbohydrates the first meal of the day because we know that the body becomes more sensitive to insulin later on in the day. Your first meal is most important.
Okay, so a lot of our listeners, when they hear the word calorie restriction, though, I think they're freaking out a little bit because we talk a lot about, a lot of our listeners come from a history of like chronic dieting, and that's kind of how they got to this point in the first place, was freaking out and like restricting their calories and getting sick. So how do we balance like knowing that calories do matter according to you and like not becoming obsessive and getting weird?
Calories always matter. Being smart matters even more. If someone has had an issue with eating disorder or things of that nature, it's really important to be sensitive for them. And it's important for them to understand that you can optimize your body composition without being in calorie restriction. Calorie restriction is simply for changing your set point or changing your body composition. It's not necessary for well-being and health.
Right. But in order to, if somebody does want to change their body composition, are you saying you might like need to monitor calories?
You always need to monitor calories because you can't change what you don't track. It's very necessary to have, it's kind of, for example, it would be if you were being treated for hypertension and the doctor came in and said, well, here's your medication. And you said, well, what's the dose? And they were like, well, I don't know, just take it, right? Who knows what the dose is? It could be anything. Well, you don't know. You can't change it if you don't know what it is.
Could somebody notice a difference, though, in their bodies, for example, by keeping the same number of calories but just switching the macros? So
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Having high protein. And when I say high protein, what I'm saying is not actually high protein. It's what should be considered normal protein.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and
that's shifting the paradigm of thinking.
Yeah. And it's funny you said that because I was actually talking to Kara about this before. I was like, I feel like, quote, high protein is normal to me. Like, I'm like, I feel like that's normal. I don't know why that's considered high. So I'm glad you brought that up.
30 grams, when you think about it, like really isn't that much.
That's the minimum. 90 grams a day is the minimum people should be taking in. That's the minimum. Yeah. My typical intake is easily 120 to 130.
How do you get all of that in a day? Because I know when I was actually tracking macros and my recommended protein intake was like 120. And I had a hard time eating that much protein. Like digestively, I felt bloated and stuffed and weird. Like, I don't know, maybe it was just a lot of food. So how do you do that?
It was easy. I broke it down to 4 or 5 meals, 3 to 4 ounces. And I take enzymes. So in my clinic, I measure stomach acid. You can see if you have hyperacid, low acid, and I take digestive enzymes, and it's super easy.
Do you give people HCl when
if they need it? I always test. I don't believe in just giving random supplements. I always do organic acid testing. I've started to do genetic testing, 23andMe and Ancestry, running it through Opus 23. I really try to utilize precision medicine because that's the way of the future.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I'm curious, do you ever see, like, say you transition somebody to a higher protein diet that makes them constipated?
Sometimes. Not often. My patients do really well because the greens, just because it's a higher protein diet doesn't mean it's green deficient. I always have them. I mean, most of their plate should be greens. If you look at a 4-ounce serving of chicken, I don't think it's that much.
It's not.
Right?
It's not at all. Yeah.
I mean, I agree with you. I easily eat 120, 130 grams every day, if not more. So that's why I'm like, it's like so weird to me that people think that it's hard to get that much in. But
Christina thinks that I don't know how much an ounce of protein is because
I don't think you do.
we were together. She lives in LA. I live in Dallas, and we got together and we were eating dinner one night, and I just had this big fillet of salmon, and she was like, that's like 8 ounces of protein, right? I'm like, no way. This is 4 ounces of protein. And I think maybe I don't know how much protein I'm actually eating. And that makes me wonder if other people don't know how much protein they're eating either, So maybe tracking is a good alternative to see how much you're getting. I could see how that could be beneficial.
It's necessary because we live in a world of surplus. Mm-hmm. There's food available. When you go to Staples, I mean, really, they don't need to have beef jerky and gummy bears at Staples. We live in this world, and we are programmed to feed, right? We are programmed to eat. So with that in mind, actually putting some awareness on what you are taking in is huge and probably the most important thing.
Yeah, I agree. And what do you think about protein powders? I know a lot of people say that they do 3 meals of the 30 grams of protein, but then another meal of the day is a protein powder. So what are your views on that? Like a protein shake?
If it's easy, it's fine. If you can eat real food, it's even better. From a biological standpoint, from an availability standpoint, when you drink a whey protein shake, you can get away with less protein. So you can get away with a serving of 20 grams of protein, has about 2.5 grams of leucine. So you don't need that 30 grams. I find that when I take a protein shake, I'm starving.
Same.
Yeah.
I try not to drink my food. It grosses me out. But but if you're on the go, totally, it's fine.
Well, what do you think about people using collagen as their source of protein, the collagen peptides?
I'm so glad you brought that up. Collagen protein is incredibly deficient in branched chain amino acids. Collagen protein does not have the branched chain amino acid, the amounts that you need. It does not stimulate muscle protein synthesis at all. In fact, it's high in glycine and proline. And there are older studies that people were just fed collagen, and that was their only protein source, and they got deathly ill because it is not a complete protein. Nobody is doing that now. Those were metabolic unit studies. Collagen protein, I treat a lot of athletes, and collagen protein I never count that in terms of protein amount. If you have collagen protein, you cannot count that towards your total protein intake.
I'm so glad that you brought that up because we had a question a while ago on an episode talking about protein powders. And I said, if you're going to do a collagen protein powder in a shake or a smoothie, make sure you add a beef protein isolate or something else on top of that if you're trying to get the muscle building benefits, because a lot of people, they think that collagen is a complete protein powder and they just mix it into all of their shakes and smoothies and they don't use anything else. And sounds like they're really missing out when they do that.
Absolutely. And the other really interesting aspect is when you look at the amount of collagen protein that you need to have some effect, the dose is about 65 grams.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Gross.
That is a lot.
And it tastes, it's so gross.
I agree.
What are your opinions on people who get their protein from nuts and seeds?
Not equivalent. We need to really touch on this whole plant-based protein.
Yeah, let's get into it.
All right, I'm ready for you. Plant protein is so different than animal protein. I will give you a very specific example. When you look at plant proteins on the label, you have to immediately cut it in half because it is really deficient in branched chain amino acids. And when we think about the quality of protein, really it's about the quality of the essential amino acids. And we know that part of the essential amino acids are the branch chains. For example, if you look at hemp protein, you could say I'm going to have 30 grams of hemp protein. Well, your body would really, for all biological purposes, see half of that. So it would see 15 grams of protein. And what we learned earlier when we talked is that you need 30 grams to stimulate mTOR and muscle protein synthesis, because muscle is the organ of longevity. So in fact, if you really wanted to get the optimal muscle protein synthesis and the amino acids that you truly need, which is the limiting factor, you'd essentially have to double your intake of that protein.
Wow.
Oh, goodness. So you're saying if you are taking a vegan protein, I just want to like reiterate that the number that it says on the bottle, like if it says 20 grams of protein, realistically, you should cut that in half because it's not as complete or not enough branch chain amino acids.
Exactly.
So all those people that are buying like I know right now have you heard of like Sasha Inchi protein? Have you heard of that before?
Completely deficient in branch chains. And we know that that's key for muscle health. I treat a lot of people that have been very, very plant-based in that way. And what happens is they end up consuming a ton of carbohydrates.
Yeah.
And not high quality protein. So their muscle gets mushy. You know, it takes 6 cups of quinoa to equal 1 chicken breast.
Yeah. I heard you say that before. That's crazy.
So when you think about that, do I think that plant-based proteins can be great? Absolutely. I think that they can be great. I think that they should be augmented with branched chain amino acids.
So if you're vegan, could you, I guess, just take like vegan protein and try to have a well-balanced vegan diet and then just take branched chain amino acids?
Absolutely. That would be ideal. That's what I do with my vegan patients.
That's interesting. I've actually never heard anyone use that before. But can people who are not vegan, what do you think of people just sipping on like the branched chain amino acids while they're working out or after their workouts, but they're not vegan?
Another great point. We know that it's the hyper amino acid, the amino acid in the blood. It needs to come in a bolus amount. You need to not sip it over time. You need to eat it or drink it all at once, because you need the elevation of the leucine to have all those beneficial effects to stop the catabolic effect in the muscle.
Okay.
You should never sip branch chains. You should never have a bite of your chicken and then go off and do something else. You really need to eat the meal, because it's, again, that elevation of the amino acids.
So it's really just all about leucine and getting enough of the amino acid. What is so special about leucine again? It stimulates mTOR. Is that what you're saying?
That is its key role. Absolutely.
Okay. And for people who don't know, I know we've gotten this far into the podcast, but people may not know, what is mTOR and what does it do?
The most important thing is there's really 4 ways to stimulate mTOR. And mTOR's primary driver is muscle protein synthesis. There's the amino acids, which is leucine, growth hormone, which is insulin, stimulates mTOR, energy, excess energy, primarily glucose, is a stimulator of mTOR, and then stress is also a stimulator of mTOR. And mTOR has multiple roles, which may not be relevant for this podcast, like S6K1 and things of that nature, which are activators and regulators of muscle protein synthesis. But the take-home point is that mTOR is responsible for muscle protein synthesis.
I have a question, just kind of trying to make this real for people. What are some symptoms of going too low in protein? Like what effects could that have?
Poor sleep, poor mood, because we know that not only does protein help with muscle mass, but it also helps with neurotransmitters, low immune system, hair loss, dry skin, flaky skin, all kinds of things. Poor gut integrity. You need glutamine.
Yeah, can we talk more about the effects of protein on gut health?
Of course. Glutamine is essential for gut health. We all know that it repairs the digestive system. Again, when you think about the tissues in the body, they're all made from proteins. It is the building blocks of everything.
I'm curious, is there anyone who you think should be on a lower protein diet? Like, is there any special situation?
People with kidney disorder, for sure. They definitely should be on a lower protein diet. Kidney disease. They've got significant kidney disease.
Okay.
I can't think of any other reason why someone should be on a low protein diet.
Well, I'm sure you saw this article circulating around a couple months ago where that woman, the bodybuilder, died, and they said it was from too much protein or over protein consumption, which I don't know if that was it. But then Chris Masterjohn came and he did this whole podcast about how a lot more people have genetic deformities or genetic predispositions to like not being able to break down and utilize protein. And that's why that happened, because she had some weird genetic thing going on in her urea cycle.
Yes.
And how common
I've never
that?
seen it. I've never, ever seen it.
So you don't really think that it's that common for people to have genetic issues to where they really should watch their protein intake?
I'd really have to look. I'd really have to look at the specific disease.
Okay.
I'm sure it's out there. I've just never encountered it. And I've seen hundreds and hundreds of patients. I've just never encountered that. But
okay.
Absolutely possible. It's incredibly unlikely.
Okay, well, see, another thing that people often say is that you have to be worried about ammonia toxicity with high protein diets.
I've never seen that.
Okay.
I mean, it's so rare. I mean, I've never seen anyone have ammonia toxicity.
Okay. Yeah, see, this is why it's so nice to talk to you, because it's like, I feel like everybody just throws out these things, and I'm like, well, I want to talk to somebody who actually, like, studies this, you know? Because there's just kind of a lot running around right now.
I've never seen someone have ammonia toxicity. I mean, that's hepatic encephalitis. I mean, I've never seen that with a patient because they ate too much protein.
Okay, good to know. I think another thing we wanted to touch on, Kara, did you have some fasting questions?
I did have some fasting questions. I saw on your Instagram, you like briefly mentioned that you weren't fasting or were fasting or something like that. And I wanted to know, like, are you doing intermittent fasting, and do you recommend that for a lot of people?
I love time restricted feeding. I absolutely love it. I do best on that. It all depends on the person and the reason why. It's really important that the treatment matches the severity of the problem or the goal that you want. For example, for me, I have a very busy life. I don't like to be eating all day long. I like to eat in a very restricted window. For example, I might eat from noon to 8 p.m. and that's it for me.
Okay.
And that's time restricted feeding.
Yeah. So you're only giving yourself like an 8-hour feeding window. What would be some reasons why somebody might want to get into that?
It definitely helps reset someone's metabolism. If they have any kind of blood sugar issues, they are constantly hungry, it allows the body, there's really amazing research that's come out that they took two groups of, I mean, this was in rats, which doesn't necessarily correlate to humans, but this study was really great, and it was on circadian rhythm and time restricted feeding. And the whole idea was to create a novel approach for weight management. And what they did is they put one group of rats on what you would consider a standard American diet. And of course, we all know what that is. And then they let them eat ad libitum, and they controlled for calories. You know, they figured out how many calories that they were taking in. And then they put another group on a time restricted feeding, but this group of rats had the same standard American diet and the same amount of calories. And what they found was that the group that had the restricted feeding window had better blood sugar regulation. They had they didn't put on weight. They actually stayed weight neutral. All their inflammatory markers remained within normal limits. What that shows is when you use time restricted feeding, it's an alternative approach for the problem of having to diet and all this inflammatory feeding. It really allows for the body to reset. And essentially, and I would never promote a poor diet, but there's more flexibility in eating poorly if it's in a restricted window.
Okay. That does make sense. I've heard a lot about that and how it really does help people with blood sugar regulation. But I've also heard the flip side of women like with hormonal imbalances already going on or thyroid disorders, and it may not be best for them. So have you seen that working with women in your clinic?
I do, absolutely. When they do a lot of fasting, their reverse T3 goes up and their cortisol goes up, because cortisol is obviously a driver of glucose release, right?
Right.
When women are hormonally challenged, I definitely do not recommend fasting or time-restricted feeding. I really want to put their body in more of a lower stress state rather than having to have their liver be responsible for gluconeogenesis. I tend to like to have them fed as opposed to restricted.
Okay. I'm glad that you pointed that out, because and a lot of women don't even know that they have hormonal imbalances and whatnot going on, and then they try fasting or time restricted feeding and they feel so terrible, so terrible, and they don't understand it's probably because there is some sort of underlying hormonal thing going on, and at the end of the day, it'd probably just be best to eat 3 square meals so you can get back on, like you said, a sort of rhythm.
And being consistent and not having chaotic eating. I have a lot of my patients eat breakfast at the same time, whether it's 10 in the morning or 6 in the morning. Be really consistent, because you can train your body. Ultimately, our brain and our mind run our body, but our body is a machine and it's an animal. So you can train it. If you are smart and intelligent, you can train your body.
So do you, for people who do want to do fasting and they don't have hormonal issues, do you always recommend a 16-8 or other versions?
16-8 is great, but start small.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to have them just begin by pushing back their feeding window until they're comfortable and it doesn't create a huge amount of stress. So, for example, if they eat normally at 7 a.m. in the morning, I push it back to 10. I just restrict I push back their window 3 hours.
Okay. And when you're saying restricting your feeding window, is this affecting calorie amount too, or is it the same amount of calories just in a smaller window?
The same amount of calories in a smaller window. It is very beneficial to do. I have some patients that are leptin resistant, and leptin is the hormone that makes you lean. When they have leptin resistance, I tend to do a 24-hour fast. I like to do 1 24-hour fast in a week, sometimes 2 in a week. It really helps with this tissue resistance and leptin resistance.
How does someone know they're leptin resistant?
I measure fasting leptin levels.
Oh,
that would do it.
Yeah.
I've never heard of that test before.
Anything over 20, I consider leptin resistant.
I'm fascinated by leptin resistance, so I'm really glad you brought that up. What else?
I saw
what else
you.
do you
I
do?
saw you on video. You definitely don't have it, so you are good.
But no, I'm just fascinated by it. Like what else do you do to combat that with people?
I do. So when I think about the leptin resistance, I definitely do fasting. I also put them on carbohydrate restriction. I always check their thyroid. I always check their reverse T3. If someone is leptin resistant, they likely need medication. I really try to get people moving quickly. So again, what we spoke about was the strategy for getting them better needs to match the intensity of where they're at. So when you're leptin resistant, that's not an easy place. These people have yo-yo dieted. Sometimes I use HCG. Sometimes I use low-dose naltrexone. I do whatever I can to help reset their system. And of course, how could I forget resistance training and high-intensity interval training?
Yeah, can we talk a little bit more about that? So how often do you recommend people do high-intensity interval training?
I'd love for them to do it 3 times a week.
Okay. And what about resistance training?
3 to 5 times a week. And I want to talk about the high-intensity training.
Yeah. As
with anything, we cannot improve what we don't measure. I find that it's very ineffective to go to the gym and say you're going to crush yourself without measuring what that means. For myself, I'll give you an example. I like to row or I like to ski erg. My target is 500 meters in under 2 minutes, and I'll do 10 rounds of that. And that way I know how I'm doing, if I'm improving, if my brain tells me I'm too tired and I'm not putting out enough. It really gives me a sense of, it's a non-emotional answer to where am I really at.
Yeah.
So it really is important, like when you go into the gym, to basically make some goals and like see if you're hitting them and how you're improving and if you are improving. Because I know a lot of people just go into the gym, like you said, and they'll do a sprint exercise, like doing a high intensity sprint exercise, but they don't really know like what the outcome of that is going to be, or they just do like 8 intervals and they don't really like measure how they feel and how they're doing. But you're saying like really have a goal for yourself and track if it's working for you.
Absolutely. And track your numbers. You can't haphazardly train and expect an amazing result. You can't go in there and say, well, I did a body sculpting class or I did a HIIT class and now it's great. Well, how do you know what your heart rate was? How do you know what your target is? Did you improve? Are you getting better every time you're training? Or every? It's really about, just as you would track your weight and your skeletal muscle and calories, you need to track your training.
Can we talk about what HIIT training really is? Because, you know, people will say, I'm going to a 60-minute HIIT class.
When you're really training, you're talking about 80-90% your VO2 max. When you're really putting out a major effort, you probably have about 10 rounds in you. And that's it. You're cashed. And if you're not doing that, you're not working hard enough.
Okay, I'm glad you said that. And back to the resistance training. So what if somebody doesn't have access to like heavy weights?
Make it happen.
Make it happen.
I mean, lift a rock in your backyard.
I mean, there's gyms everywhere, unless you're living in Siberia or somewhere, and they probably have gyms there too. There's no excuse. If your why is strong enough, you get it done. People will always search for if they're not committed, you will always search for a reason why you cannot do it. I would say search for a reason why and how you are going to do it. How are you going to get it done?
I actually
this is your life.
Like
this is
that.
super.
Yeah.
This is it. This is one life. Make it happen. Let's go. Optimize your body composition. Have the muscle. Age well, and have an amazing life. And if you don't fight for that, we live in a society that is going to crush that out of you.
Yes.
That is so incredibly true. And I love that because there are like you said, people will make excuses for just about everything. And I probably do that as well. I mean, we all do it at some point or another, but that is the biggest thing is like, oh, well, I don't have access to weights. And you're just like, so make it happen. I love that, like no excuses. So I know that people don't have access to heavy weights. So what they do instead are like circuit type workouts or body weight type workouts. So is that really going to be as effective for burning fat or building muscle as heavy weights would be? Or what would that do for you?
In terms of building muscle mass requires tearing it down. To really effectively tear it down, you could probably do a bunch of body weight and all of that stuff, and that can be great. But if you really want to have stimulated your muscle, break it down and build it up, it requires stress. It requires challenging the tissue, and it requires incredible effort.
Okay, so it really is an answer.
The long-winded answer to that is no, lift heavy weights. I mean, listen, Stu Phillips out of McMaster University just came out with a study that said high volume, as long as you're going to muscular fatigue, has been shown to have the same effect as heavy weights. And that was in an older population. That may be true. But again, it goes back to how hard are you willing to work? I have never seen an amazing body weight workout, someone who just does body weight workout and have incredible muscle tissue. The body becomes resilient under stress. It grows through resistance.
Can we talk about the effects of cardio on muscle?
Absolutely. Cardio is catabolic to muscle unless you're sprinting. It elevates cortisol. If you've never seen someone who does a ton of cardio be super muscular, they're really in a more of a catabolic state. It's like death by cardio. I mean, think about it. You go to the gym and you see the same people on the same step mill every day for a couple years, and their body composition has never changed.
Yeah.
Right.
Very true.
So what, though, is lifting heavy weights? Like, how can you really define that? Because I guess some people don't know, like, what would be considered heavy, or how do you know when you are lifting heavy?
So there's a perceived exertion, and it would really be about, I mean, you can test out your 1 rep max. You can get with a great trainer. I mean, I'm lucky. I live in New York City. I have the best coach in the world. His name is Ed Napper, in case any of your listeners want to find him, although he's probably too busy because who knows, but I mean, he's an amazing coach, right? So you find an amazing coach and they will determine if you're lifting heavy. I mean, I used to think, well, I'm trained heavy, and then started training with Ed, and when you have an amazing coach, you realize that you can put out at least 20% more than you think you can.
Okay. That does make sense. So you really, it's all about perceived exertion, like you said, like kind of how difficult it is for you.
And exactly. And you really have got to test it out. So you should test your 1 rep max. You should test these things. And then you scale it based on that, based on percentages.
Okay. And this is kind of a random question, but I have heard a lot that like lifting heavy is going to help you gain more muscle, and then in turn having more muscle will help you become like leaner and burn more fat. But what's going on with people that are lifting really heavy but they have higher amounts of body fat? Is that like an issue with macronutrients? Or I've heard a lot of people say they lift really heavy but they actually kept on more body fat, and once they scaled back on the weight they lost more body fat.
It could be. That's a really interesting point. The body responds very differently. It can be a macro issue. It can be an inflammatory issue. It could be that their body isn't designed to work like that, and they were actually putting themselves through way more stress, which elevated their cortisol and elevated their inflammatory markers so much that they ended up being in a very fight or flight state, which we know packs on body fat.
Yeah, that's a really great point.
So in terms of lifting, what is your opinion on, I mean, I've heard some people consider circuits and supersetting as a form of cardio versus like straight sets. Do you have an opinion on that? And like kind of related.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. That's my favorite form of cardio is lifting weights faster.
Okay. So like that's how you would do it. That's your preferred way.
My preference involves a little bit of suffering, which people might think that's a bit crazy. I tend to like metcons. I tend to really like pushing myself.
Okay, so yeah, I was gonna ask you like what your opinion is on like CrossFit.
I think if your mechanics are great and you have a great coach, it's fantastic.
Okay.
Nothing wrong with it.
Do you incorporate any forms of cardio besides just lifting weights faster?
Lifting weights faster. I do 3 metcons a week. I like to do 1 long ruck on a Sunday, which could be, that's under load. So I pack in quite a bit of weight on my back and I walk paced for 4 to 5 hours, no rest. It's a long steady state. That's fun to me.
Wow.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
And what's a metcon for people that don't know?
Metabolic conditioning. So that would be a row sequence, that kind of thing.
Cool. Yeah, it sounds like you're in really great physical shape if you go on 4 to 5 hour walks with a heavy backpack.
No, you know what it is? I think that just some people define fun differently.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, actually, I think that could be kind of fun depending on where you're walking, but I'm impressed. Yeah. I'm very impressed.
Same.
It's fun. It's really fun.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for hopping on with us today and answering all of our questions. You're amazing. And could you just remind our listeners where they could find you if they want more from you?
Yeah, they can find me on Instagram, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. They can find me on my website, drgabriellelyon.com, and my Facebook.
Amazing. Well, thank you again so much. It was such a pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks for coming.